All right. Well, welcome everyone to the November 24th SIG Node meeting. We have probably two things. One, I don't know, Sergey, if you had a chance to get the update on where we were with PRs, but if so, do you want to talk through that and then take the agenda for your item?
Yeah, PRs looked good. I actually expected worse with the freeze, but we merged quite a lot, so it's good. I didn't have time to review the how to separate SIG Node PRs from non-SIG Node PRs, but yeah, something I'm working on in the background. So I wanted to bring this topic of conformance testing. So I've been working on this runtime class GA functionality, and part of this GA, we GA'd API for runtime classes. And apparently, like I didn't know that, APIs are being conformance tested, and there is a metric tracking how many APIs covered this conformance testing. So how, like specifically, every API needs to be called during the test that is marked specifically as a conformance. So like some tests covers this APIs just by chance, like there is a test that calls APIs to do something on this API, and like this hits an endpoint, and it works great. But some tests are basically crude test, create, remove, update, delete. So I mean, this test are so it's basically like hitting API endpoints explicitly, and I mean the only thing they test is actually that API works. So the feedback was that we need more tests, more conformance tests for the feature, and I was trying to wrap my head around what is conformance test and what are the limitations, and I wanted to discuss it here. So one example I wanted to walk through is like why, for instance, there is a like PID limiting feature, and is it needed to be conformance tested or not? Because it doesn't hit any APIs. Is it still required to be conformance testing, or like desired to be conformance tested, or it's something that we cannot conformance test because it's very close to the hardware, to like how many not hardware, like very close to like how exactly PID limiting works, and yeah. So
Sergey, I apologize. I had trouble following one phrase you used. So are you referencing a different API than runtime class as a maybe a complementary example to what you were talking about, or what was I missed what you said there?
So there is a runtime class API that like runtime class features that we want to test, and feature like consists of multiple pieces, like how we schedule node pods, how we create runtime classes and create runtime handlers. So all like and all these aspects needs to be conformance tested. No, let me put it this way. I'm not sure which aspects of this feature needs to be conformance tested. And PID limiting I use as an example of features that doesn't affect.
PID limiting? Is that what you said?
PID limiting. Yeah, PID
Okay,
limiting is example of features that we just GA'd and we didn't conformance test, and it doesn't affect any APIs. So I wonder if it doesn't affect any APIs, does it need to be still conformance tested, or it's impossible to conformance test? And I just use it as an example, as a proxy to understand how, like what features of runtime class I need to test with conformance tests.
Yeah, so I think let me try to give the best guidance I can give here. So for features that touch the end user facing API, so what a typical user of a cluster could see given a kube config, those APIs should have basic CRUD level tests. So things like runtime class. I think even when I looked at your PR before, you had create, update, list, delete, and then I think if I look at Aaron's comment there, he might be suggesting some additional ones, like to ensure a pod could potentially be scheduled to with an associated runtime class, or that maybe some other criteria fail. So I think the guidance he gave at the end of your linked PR is accurate. So like the minimal set for an end user facing eye should be the CRUD testing, and then up beyond that, it's testing the ability to consume that API without having to pre-declare or define how the cluster was maybe configured. So some of his examples here were like create a pod with a non-existent runtime class. Like I think that's a good test, right? And we should see what happens if that wasn't in there. Creating it with an existing, that's a good test as well. So his 4 that he enumerated are all good extensions. And if we map that back to things like, I don't know, quota, like if you look at the conformance tests for quota, we have create quota, list quota, update quota, get quota, and then we have a couple quota specific conformance tests like can we do object count quota with an arbitrary CRD, for example, or something. And so I think Aaron's feedback here is good on maybe the 4 tests that he recommended calling out. And then his secondary feedback here on saying, which was my original feedback on your PR, which was like we couldn't put into conformance the behavior associated with any particular handler. I think he's echoing that same statement. So I would contrast this with the PIDs feature in the sense that the PIDs feature didn't change the end user API. It only changed what the kubelet sandboxed. And as a result, it's not necessarily elevated up into the API conformance definition of are you or are you not a Kubernetes cluster.
So
if in the future we made PIDs schedulable, right, where on the actual end user pod spec, you could say, I want to get, this many tasks or this many tasks, that would be expected to be surfaced up through conformance and would need to fail gracefully if a node did not advertise like a quantity of PIDs.
so there is a feature for PID available eviction. So this can be configured, right? So is this something that we need to conformance test as opposed to like I understand like
so conformance test is not typically touching. The conformance tests are intended to operate on a level above the configuration of a given discrete component. So the conformance tests are intended to pass for any cluster that the operator may have put together without having to require those tests to know how to change the kubelet eviction parameters or a particular controller manager flag. Where there are specific tests that are in the end-to-end suite that might depend on a particular controller manager flag being set, those tests are perfectly fine to write, but they're not tests that can be elevated into conformance because people can choose to enable or disable that particular flag.
Okay, so in runtime class case, we can check that pod was scheduled, but we shouldn't check that it's actually running, right? So
right, that would be a good example. And so then like, I think on the feedback there, it's like if there was a particular handler that said this turned on gvisor or this turned on kata or something like that, that's something that we couldn't put under conformance, but we should at least know if a pod got scheduled as an example to another could map it. So trying to think where there are other examples, like if dynamic kubelet config ever got promoted to GA, we would be in a tough spot to work out how to properly do conformance testing on that. But I think right now, given our plan was not to do that, like that would have been the tricky one.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of other features that we just promoted to GA, and we have this startup probe promotion, and I'm not sure whether startup probe was tested with conformance.
Yeah, I don't know if Andrew is on here. I did review some PRs, I think, from Andrew on that. I don't remember if they got elevated to conformance or not. I think at first we said don't put them in.
No, this is exactly.
I created a follow-up PR that just adds the probe timeout test to conformance or node conformance. I don't know if there's a distinction between, like, do node conformance tests just go into regular conformance?
I'm talking about earlier one from Matthew about startup probe. So actually, existence of startup probe wasn't a GA feature before, and we just made it GA.
I'm sorry, Sergey, you broke up for me there. Startup probe what?
So Startup Probe was also promoted GA. So Andrew feature, which is exec timeout, is one, but we also promoted Startup Probe as a part of, like, I mean, Startup Probe wasn't GA before; it was beta feature. It was always,
if it appears in the pod spec and a user could consume it, and it's not tied to a particular hardware profile of that node, then we should look to get coverage within conformance. As a project, we know we're not perfect on this right now, but like it's possible we had an error or omission on that one and we need to go back and correct it. But for that one, very clearly, yes, we can go back and check if we did the right thing or not.
Okay. And for Andrew point about node conformance versus regular conformance for exec timeout, is there a difference between node conformance and regular conformance?
Yeah, so regular conformance is basically what drives the CNCF trademark usage. It does not pick up from node conformance right now. What we had labeled node conformance was intended to be tests that would have been appropriate for wherever a kubelet is running without any particular hardware profile configuration. So like SE Linux tests, I don't think got labeled node conformance because you might be running on an AppArmor environment as an example. But other more generic tests, I think, were labeled node conformance. I can go back and try to find where we defined the definition, but it's not tied to Cube project-wide conformance suite.
Yes, the startup probes and the exec probe timeout seems like something that should be added to both like standard conformance and node conformance.
Yeah, and then the one issue, which was only with the Docker runtime, something wasn't being respected. That would be an outlier, but for the other two, for sure. Anything that appears on a pod spec is a good guidance. So for your PR here then, Sergey, are we going to be able to address the feedback, I guess, in time for the release, or are we having to move GA?
So I think we're good for the release because we are green on API scoop, but I hope that we can move this adding more tests into 121, so to minimize the possible problems on breakage. I mean, I don't want to push another PR promoting some tests right now on a short schedule and potentially break something. If it's okay, I can do it in 121.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for bringing up the topic, and hopefully those who are going through their first GA promotion here, we can share our past learnings. I didn't see anything else on today's agenda, and I have a conflict in a few minutes with DIMS to help teach a class about Kubernetes. So were there other topics that people wanted to raise now? Otherwise, we could adjourn for.
If I could, this is Hippie Hacker, and I work with the CNCF on the conformance program. I wanted to take a quick tour, and it doesn't have to be the answers back now, but we have the website API snoop.cncf.io, and on there we have our list of APIs. And I wanted to go beyond. Right now, if you go to stable and click on node, you'll see the work that Sergey did for that promotion. I suspect there may be other APIs that are either beta, alpha, or hidden underneath one of those groupings, particularly in core, that could possibly be stewarded and owned by SIG Node that I'm not aware of the relationship with. It's hard to track down. So particularly inside of stable core, and I'll drop that link into the channel as well and back into the doc. If I could get some ideas of if any of those remaining, particularly the ones in gray, should be owned by SIG Node, that would help us to collaborate on helping get those endpoints tested. Because Node's been around since the beginning.
Yeah, so just pulling up the links now. At least on the first, when you look under Node, it's just capturing the Node API resource itself. For the other ones here, I can go through.
There's another more, just a list, and I'll drop this here. This is a list that currently, as of 120, they are completely untested. And so that list, it's quite long, but this is the remaining debt. How long is this one? It's 155 points.
And just for my own recollection, then this is only capturing if we call that API endpoint, but is unaware of the actual communication on that endpoint, right? So we don't know if it exercises every feature associated with a resource.
That's the conformance project. So if it actually has conformance, then it should have that. There are cases where that's not the case.
Okay.
These particular ones are completely unhit. And the definition of hit is the EDE .test user agent hitting the API server itself in the context of an EDE test run, because we updated the framework to include the test that is currently getting executed in the user agent, and that's logged in the API server's audit logs and included in this database.
Okay. Yeah.
My
so
main
just like,
ask is, go ahead.
no, it's fine. I was just trying to the second list you sent, which talks about untested endpoints then. So deleting the node collection, that stands out as something that we could go and write the test for to ensure that doesn't actually happen.
Read core status and node status, read and replace are somewhat difficult to hit via the K8s API or via the Golang library. You may have to, because we've hit a lot of these, you may have to go a little extra step to be sure and hit and replace those from the EDE binary. But that would give us 3 more points that are definitely within SIG Node's operations that are publicly exposed in core that every provider should be able to ensure that is tested.
Yeah, so replace core v1 node status. I guess for that one, we'd have to do some, maybe at best we could do negative testing, because in theory, only the kubelet agent itself should be allowed to update its status. So we could, that's one we can follow up on. I'll take a note. And then, but yeah, I appreciate you bringing this list forward. I'll take a look.
Thank you. A question from Andrew. It can show those tests, but right now we only show it at the top level. So if you go and explore that area to see if there's an API only integration test, it'll just show on the top front page. If you scroll down, it'll show new promotions within this release, and it'll say tested or conformance tested. You can actually scroll down and see that flow control API server has normal tests, but no conformance tests. So they haven't added the conformance bracket to it. As far as integration test, if that's not the same as EDE, I may be misunderstanding.
Cool. Well, thank you, Hippie, for sharing the information here. And then hopefully, Sergey, you at least have a clear understanding on next steps forward. And with that, are there any other items that people want to raise? Or I'm sure many of us in the US are excited to potentially begin our holidays. All right, well, thanks again, everybody. And talk to you all there. Have a good Thanksgiving for those that celebrate. Bye all.
Bye, folks.